We should introduce our season premiere episode
Season 2.
Season 2. It's a special beginning for Season 2, Episode 1. We're going to start with Stu Barr. We're going to demonstrate, as you remember from Season 1, we talked a lot about what we call the Inspirational 6. And it consisted of to animate in a classroom, to originate, to rejuvenate, to stimulate. And an interesting idea from theatrics called Deus Ex Machina, and the last one to tell the story. And so instead of talking more about specifics of these, you can always go back to Season 1 and review those major topics. But we thought we'd go through an in-class demonstration, which will start with Stu, and I'll let you introduce what we're going to talk about, Stu.
I'm going to go through one, kind of what I used to do when I'd introduce Homer's Iliad. The subjects I would cover, how I would use these I-6. And I'm going to divide that up into 3 approximately 15-minute episodes. And then we're going to go from the literary end, from the Homer, to a scientific end, where Tony will do a book it's about 20 years old, A World Without Time, about the friendship of Albert Einstein and Kurt Gödel and how it intermeshed with philosophy.
So, yeah, what we pretty much do is we're going to intermix all these 6 strategies that we used in teaching. When we do teach, we go through these same strategies, but we thought you'd like to see more of what it's actually done. And Stu's going to start with the Iliad. He'll do 3 episodes on what he just talked about in terms of Homer and certain strategies that he would use in class, demonstrating these ideas, and I'll do it on science and mathematics.
And at the end of each of our 3 episodes,
we'll conclude with a summary.
We'll show you where we use them, each one of those exercises. Right. So it's not just an abstraction you put on the board, and it goes to the point we've always said when you introduce the I-6, you're not adding something new to the class. It's not a curriculum addition. It's part of the curriculum.
Exactly.
And we're going to demonstrate how that works.
And feel free to use the mute button when Stu Barr talks at any time that you would like.
And if you're watching this on video, be sure to turn the film off. Once you've seen Tony, how much more do you need to see?
Well, to a person who actually walked the hills with Homer, let's leave it now to our first episode, Season 2.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Shape Shorts. I'm Stu Barr, and you'll notice I'm by myself. I'm missing something. It's gone. There is a God. Anyway, what I want to do today for the next 3 episodes, we're going to illustrate how to do the I-6. How do we put the I-6 into a classroom without just adding? And I'm going to do this by doing some of the lectures we would do on the Iliad when I was doing Humanities. So, bear with me. I got to get into character here. Now, when you'd start on the Iliad, I would tell students, look around. Iliad's an oral story passed down in an oral tradition for many, many generations. Now, how many people have heard the story that if it's oral, it changes? In a classroom, you give someone a story at the beginning, you tell them that they're doing this, and it goes up and down. By the time it gets to the back of the room, it's a different story. So that is always the evidence that anything orally passed down doesn't really portray anything accurately. Now I want to ask, is that really true? What if I change that? What if I change the oral story that you have and I make that story in rhyme and meter, and I take that story, even put it to music? How well will you remember it? I can give you a little clue for everybody out there. You've already done it. How do I know? How many of you have memorized an advertised jingle that you absolutely hate? But every time you hear 1 or 2 notes, 1 or 2 words, you memorize the whole thing. You didn't sit down and study it. You didn't do that. Every modern advertiser uses what every person in an oral tradition knew 3,000 years ago. The human mind works beautifully with rhyme and meter. Put a note to it, and you memorize everything. I start in that same classroom, and I give you a story in a rhyme and meter, a story you like, And I'll guarantee you when it gets to the back of the room, it's in the same story. Two things happen. A rhyme and meter you can't really change because you got to change the meter. You got to be cleverer than most people. Also, once you've done that, you like the story. It comes up again in music. How many people, whatever your age, you hear one or two notes of a song, and that song, well, for old people like me and Tony, he's not here so I can make fun of him. For old people like Tony, you can memorize, you hear one or two notes, and you know the whole thing. Whether it's a pop culture song, a rock song, even classical music, as complicated as that is, you hear it a number of times. You don't have to be a musician. It's in your head. You know what comes next. You know how it works. Everything else. Oral traditions are, in fact, very, very accurate. They tend to give you exactly what the original author intended. An oral tradition will be much more accurate, actually, than a written. And here's one of the reasons you can look at that and know. When I write something down, it's accurate maybe when I wrote it. Language changes, culture changes, everything else. The moment you change language, you change culture, you change the story. Words have different meanings throughout cultures. They have all kinds of different things. I'll give you an example of what I mean. In Latin, the word luna we translate as moon. And so if I read an English translation, I see luna equals moon. But that's not what a Roman thought luna was. Luna wasn't just the moon. It was a goddess. It embodied the light at night. It embodied a whole set of concepts. I tell a modern English speaker, moon is just a body orbiting the earth. There's no stories connected with Luna. The Roman knew what Luna meant in a sense we don't understand, even though I literally translate it as the same thing. When you have an oral tradition and you pass this on, you pass certain things down. Other things about oral traditions, they're not passed down to the entire group. They tend to be tribal, and I'll use the Celtic word for it, a bard. The bard tells the story. The bard tells the story in the rhyme and meter. The bard repeats the story. The bard's often a member of the same families that's told the stories for generations. The bard is often one of the most important members of the family, the tribe, or the group, because the bard isn't the history of the group. The bard is what the group has become. Now, another thing we see with Homer, and I'll talk about it in the next episode, but do oral traditions contain history? Do they contain this? The answer is yes and no. And the reason I say yes and no, we're going to look at this, but whether I'm reading the Iliad, the Bible, or anything else, the things we divide in our world to history, literature, philosophy, science, math, the things we divide the entire world up into are nothing more than categorizations done in classical and Hellenistic Greece. Homer doesn't live in that age. He lives way before that age. If you ask Homer, is this history? He's going to go, what? He's not interested in that. The word doesn't exist in this. What exists is the story. Now, give you another modern look at that. How many of you tell stories? I can tell you, you all have stories. I talk about Darth Vader. Unless you've been off this planet for the last 50 years, you know exactly what I'm referring to. If I say the Force, you know what I'm referring to. Okay? These are modern stories where I can make references to that story without telling you the story, and yet you know what the story is. So, in the ancient world, a lot of times where we lose understanding is a bard will make reference to a story we no longer have. So we can lose some of the meaning. We can lose how that story was constructed originally. In this, using Homer again. Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey only form 2 parts of an 8-part epic cycle. A lot of the other stories are around, but they're only in pieces. When we look at those pieces now, what we see in Homer, we have a lot of Homer repeating those pieces because it's part of the way the rhyme and meter works. You reinforce it. But it's often repeated in the way I just said. If I were to say to someone in a piece of literature, the person reminds me of Darth Vader. Well, what happens if there's no literature and someone reads that 3,000 years from now? They'll know there's some entity in literature called Darth Vader, but they're not going to understand what it is. They're not going to understand what that is. If I make a casual reference using Star Wars again, Luke, I am your father. How many people have seen Star Wars know exactly what that is? Would someone know that 500 years from now? Unless they have that story with them. One of the things we see in the ancient world is so many stories are gone. We try to recompose them from there. And the Iliad is no exception. There's portions of the Trojan epic cycle that are gone. Another thing to remember, cultures, histories, everybody, we all create epic cycles. We like them. One of the problems with the Romans is they borrowed the Greek one, but they really didn't have one. So they used Virgil to create the Aeneid. He's part of the Trojan epic cycle, but they take something out of the Trojan epic cycle, and Virgil takes the Aeneid and gives it Roman virtues that Homer would never have used in it, to try and create a basis for that. In Rome, you have the story of Romulus and Remus. You have the whole thing set up as a story. Is it of any concern whether Romulus or Remus ever existed in a way we use it in the modern sense? If I'm a Roman 2,000 years ago, the answer is no. I don't care. It's not even in my lexicon. And I bring this all up when we study any ancient literature. This is where we run into problems. We take 20th, 21st century values, we impose them on the 8th century BC and try to force them to work. And when you do that, you run into problems on that. We tend to try to teach it that way, the same thing. Homer isn't a 20th or 21st century writer. He writes from his world, but he's still a classic. Now, as a student, I want to bring this up here. I've had students ask me, what makes something a classic? Brilliant question. They have every right to ask it. And I answer a simple answer. Anything is a classic in any culture when that piece of work, whether it be music, literature, whatever, responds to all of us as human beings, regardless of our culture, regardless of our time, regardless of where we come from. It speaks to the thing of being human. When you do that, you have created a classic. It's also the reason there's so few classics, because it's an extremely hard thing to do. When Homer writes that, when Homer puts that stuff down, he doesn't think he's writing a classic. He's not sitting down there, well, I think I'm going to compose an oral classic. And that. The other thing we have to look at is Homer. Did he actually write it? My answer to that is, does it matter? Most likely he went ahead and took old sources, composed them into a rhyme and meter in archaic Greek, and created a story that has become one of the foundations of Western literature. Later on, in episode 3, I'm going to go over why it is a classic, why it speaks to you as a human being from the very beginning of the story, in the opening lines. What makes it a classic? But to be a classic, it speaks to you. And it's no accident that in modern drama, television stuff, why do we repeat these themes over and over? Why do I have Brad Pitt movie about Achilles and Troy? Why 2,800 years later do I have that story and it made millions of dollars for the producers? Why? And it's worldwide, by the way, not just in the Western world. Why did that happen? And you have to ask yourself that question when you're looking into why does that story speak to them? Why did the producers make money? They're not there to sit there and produce something as a loser. Why did they make not only the story of that, why did they make it almost 3.5 hours? How many people sit through a 3.5 hour movie? And yet they knew they could make money on that. Why? The story's been told. No one goes to the story of Troy and thinks the city of Troy is going to survive. You already know the answer. You know the whole story. Why are you watching it? Why are you doing that? And all of this is what I bring up when we talk about what is the traditions that lead to it, the oral traditions that lead up to these stories. And some people will see this controversial, but I don't care. This is when people try to literally translate the Bible, they miss the entire point. You spend your time wondering whether King David existed or not, and did he actually did Solomon have a big temple? You know, in the reality, Who cares? What is the story trying to tell me about humanity? What's it telling me about myself as a human being? While I'm looking for all of that, I'm missing the very essence. And in the end, that's just a waste of my time. And my advice to anybody teaching this, and look, speak to the person today. In reality, these pieces of literature speak today as much as they spoke 2,000, 3,000 years ago. And why? Well, let's face it, we're not really that much different. Our differences are minuscule compared to our commonality with our ancestors and who we are, the literature we compose, everything else. And that's what makes these things fascinating to read. It also can make them extremely boring when you spend your time asking a student to repeat something over and over they have no knowledge of, no meaning of. When that student understands that an oral tradition is something they already do every day when they memorize a song, even when they don't want to, in advertising, now they understand that that oral tradition is far greater than anything they would have seen before. That oral tradition is relaying something to them that has long since. The story may seem obsolete. The humanity is today. And that, I think, is what is often missed when we lecture on these classes, we go up on them, we show them a bunch of slides or PowerPoints. We do not ask the student to sit around the fire with Homer and listen to the story of Troy, the humanity, the problems, and the anger, the rage that existed that created a disaster for everyone involved. Thank you.
Well, Stu, how'd you feel about that?
And it was fun.
But the main thing is, I never saw so many students run out of this room as when you finished your collection. What did you do?
They got
out.
the anger message.
That must have been it. Well, let's summarize a little
They're
bit.
going home, I think. At least they're not here.
Well, I'll put it this way: they're not waiting outside. Unless they are,
No, we looked out the window.
We're going to go out the back way.
Okay.
From the studio. Let's summarize just a little bit about how you integrated all the I6 into the Inspirational 6 into each lecture. And we should tell the audience that you do this in a natural way. It's not done. And most professors do this, and those that are in academics or are going to be at a university or secondary education.
And I think
is, yeah.
when you do it, and for all of you, when we look at this, as Tony just said, many of you do it already, you haven't identified it. And it becomes naturally part of it.
Right. So let's go over some of these,
Yeah, sure.
okay? Let's review the I6 are to animate, to originate, to rejuvenate, to stimulate, demonstrate deus ex machina, and to tell the story. We'll elaborate a little more as we go along. But in the first episode, this episode here, you brought out oral tradition into animate. You brought out the notion of our oral history, which is something that is sometimes obfuscated in the classroom, our oral history.
And part of the animation, you bring it out because they're already doing oral. They do oral traditions with music. And
to animate is to energize the topic matter, to really put it into perspective of historical, contemporary, relevant, and unorthodox examples, which you did.
Yeah.
And talk about Homer and talking about the notion of what we know about Troy today in this context. And also you brought it back at the end to animate, because you ended up with the notion of our oral tradition.
Yeah, and I think some of that, part of the emphasis on there was the oral tradition and how it didn't die at all. It's part of us. When I brought up the advertising, it's still part of it. And that gives what seems like an ancient story it's not ancient at all, and it's not separate from you.
Exactly. And to originate would be to show how old ideas have become modern. And you did that by bringing up the notion of song, sonnet, how we know songs. You can be given the first few parts of a lyric and people can finish them off. Contemporary songs, older songs, Happy Birthday, and so on and so forth. We'll do it. Jingle Bells does it too. You brought up the notion of Luna and how it meant the moon, but it was in a different context in those days. And you brought up the idea of stories, which are really all part of the notion of to originate ideas. And, of course, bringing in current movies from within the past decade, let's say. Star Wars and Brad Pitt in Troy in this context. So there's a livelihood there. then you brought in the notion of rhyme and meter to rejuvenate. And rejuvenate would be to bring enthusiasm for knowledge, for understanding the excitement of knowledge, right? How our intellect is really more potent than almost anything that we have physically. Our intellect is sometimes non-fungible. You can't grab it, but you know it when you have it. And you did that with rejuvenation and bringing in Roman and by bringing in Roman and Homer. Mm-hmm. You're talking about a 500 to 1,000 year period here, and when you think about it, about Troy itself. And then you kind of put in to stimulate, and the stimulate is to shift the students from being passive learners to active learners. And this, I think, you did throughout the whole thing, right?
Yeah, and I think some of it asking them even about, you tell stories all the time. I tell you a story at the beginning. It's the same at the end if I put it in a rhyme and meter.
And you brought up some good questions. Usually, when you really want to stimulate a class, you ask a question, and you just don't ask it and then move on and answer it. You get the student to participate, and you ask, "What is a classic?" And of course, I had to wake up a few students that were already here.
I threw them out. Remember?
It cost me a lot there to get these students over here.
I had to throw them out.
Yeah, well, you did.
You need to do a better job of hiring.
We had to edit that out. Anyway.
Yeah. Yes, Sparky will do.
And then a very interesting question that you brought up, I thought, in this particular episode was, did Homer really write it? And you said, who cares? Yeah. Right? Yeah. And you look back and you go, there have been many stories of Troy. And one thing that is interesting is that most people think in the Iliad, Homer's Iliad, there's the Trojan horse. You never once mentioned it because
it's not in the Iliad.
It's not in the Iliad, at least in Homer's version of the Iliad. So these are all of all the I6 you brought in: animate, originate, rejuvenate, and stimulate in various ways. And not one of these took more than about 3 to 10 seconds of interjection, which doesn't interfere with curriculum structure or the notion that a professor would say something like, well, we don't have time for that. Well, I think we need to make time for that.
Well, and I think you just hit on a point. A lot of times people look at this as an addition. There's no addition. You and I have been talking about this for years.
Years.
You're not adding anything. And when you see it actually done, you realize there's nothing. You're not adding a thing.
You're not adding, but you're adding a lot.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is you're putting into more of a composition, and you're augmenting, and not putting in a separate topic.
You're not just droning on about a subject, boring yourself and everybody else.
Well, Sparky just gave us our cutoff, and so we now have to move on to. You're going to continue now with episode 2, is that right?
That's right. Yeah. We'll start with episode 2.
I don't know. I'm find those students now. I have to repay them to come back in again.
Yeah. Well, they left. I wouldn't repay them. I'd get your money back.
Okay. Thank you, Stu.
Okay.